Okay. All right. Welcome back, everyone, to our latest installment of the online Peace Science Colloquium. I'm your co-organizer, Brad Smith. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University, and I organize this colloquium along with my Vanderbilt University colleague, Cassie Dorff, who's also an assistant professor here with me. So if you're tuning in for the first time, this colloquium is affiliated with the Peace Science Society International, and our mission is to bring the great research that happens at each year's annual meeting of the Society to all of you all year long, because of course, when the meeting ends, you don't all stop doing research. And so our goal is to bring that into your homes and your offices year round. And especially we're hoping that at this time of social distancing that we can be a way to maintain a little bit of normalcy to your day. So today we have an excellent paper that's going to be presented by Pearce Edwards, who's a PhD candidate at Emory University. He'll be presenting Religious Institutions and Resistance to Dictators, the Bishops Opposed to Argentina's Dirty War. We have an excellent panel of discussants who are all experts on the topic. First, we have Courtenay Conrad, who's an associate professor at University of California, Merced. We have Christopher Sullivan, who's an assistant professor at Louisiana State University, and we also have Jason Wittenberg, who's a professor at University of California, Berkeley. So with that, I'll turn over the floor to Pearce, if everybody could mute their microphones, and we'll get started.
Great. Thank you all so much for coming. I appreciate the discussant's time and the opportunity to present this paper, and I look forward to the discussion. I'm Pearce Edwards. I'm a PhD candidate at Emory University, and I'm presenting my paper entitled Religious Institutions and Resistance to Dictators, the Bishops Opposed to Argentina's Dirty War. Now, there are prominent examples of religious leaders who have resisted dictatorships over the last century. In Brazil, Bishop Elder Câmara was a Catholic archbishop who led a movement of human rights and of the poor against the country's right-wing military dictatorship from the 1960s to the 1980s. In Iraq, the Shia cleric Mohammed al-Sadr led a movement of poor Shias against the country's dictatorship under Saddam Hussein in the latter half of the 20th century. And in South Vietnam, the Buddhist abbot Quang Duc famously self-immolated in resistance to the country's dictatorship in 1963, leading to the eventual downfall of the regime later that year. Now, these are all examples of religious leaders in institutions who we know from a broader literature are able to affect political identity, participation, collective action, and even contribute to regime change and transitions to democracy in dictatorships. For this reason, the leaders of these institutions are particularly important in dictatorships. They are among the communal elite who support regimes seek in order to justify the use of their coercive power and their political survival. This leads to the question of interest for my project, is that when these leaders withdraw their support for the regime and oppose it, are they able to constrain the regime's use of coercive power against its citizens? To preview the argument, I focus on opposed religious leaders who resist repression, which is state coercion used in a way which violates basic rights, against citizens in authoritarian regimes. I argue that these leaders are particularly formidable opponents of repression because they have two characteristics: local embeddedness and public influence. Leaders are locally embedded in that they can gather information about what goes on in their jurisdiction, particularly as it relates to repression, and they also have public influence. They serve as opinion leaders, and this leadership is derived from their traditional authority. In response to these opposed leaders, regimes may attempt to co-opt them, buying their loyalty or repressing them, either eliminating or constraining their ability to speak out. However, I argue that these methods are ineffective against opposed leaders, and regimes' best response is to accommodate and concede, at least in part, to these leaders' demands. This leads to a reduction in repression in areas under these leaders' jurisdiction. I test this argument in Argentina during the period 1976 to 1983, and I focus on the country's Catholic bishops, who are subnational leaders of the Catholic Church, a worldwide religious institution, and they operated in a country, Argentina, which was 90% Catholic during this period. I focus on the country's dirty war, which was a campaign of repression carried out by a right-wing military dictatorship, and during this period, more than a quarter of the country's Catholic bishops opposed the regime. I also demonstrate through qualitative and quantitative evidence that the appointment of these bishops was plausibly exogenous to both political and socioeconomic characteristics of the areas in which they had jurisdiction. This allows me to identify the effect of these bishops on repression in these areas. I find that opposed bishops were able to reduce repression in areas under their jurisdiction, potentially saving hundreds of lives during the dictatorship. I also adjudicate several mechanisms which could explain this relationship, and I conclude that the most plausible mechanism which explains this effect is public mobilization against repression. This paper makes several contributions to the literature on contentious politics and authoritarian politics. First, I consider a different type of power than is traditionally discussed in this literature, focusing on the symbolic and traditional power of these religious leaders rather than the coercive power of the state. I also focus on how non-state actors, such as religious leaders, are able to constrain the use of repression rather than focusing on how state actors themselves use repression against targets. I'm also able to demonstrate subnational variation in a religious institution which at the national level is otherwise reputed to be closely aligned with a dictatorship. As a way of an outline, I'm going to introduce the theory. I'll briefly describe the case. I'll then outline the research design, present results and analysis, and conclude with some discussion. To introduce the theory, I first begin by defining religious institutions. Religious institutions are a type of civil society organization with adherents and members among the civilian population. These institutions engage their members with a bundle of rituals and ideational content, resources, hierarchies, networks, and social service provision. Now, these institutions have complex relationships with dictatorships. On one hand, they may acquiesce to or support dictatorships, lending credibility and shoring up these dictatorships' political survival. On the other hand, there is a lengthy historical record of these religious institutions serving as opposition to dictatorships. There's examples of religious institutions fostering opposition to dictatorship in examples as wide-ranging as Nazi-occupied Europe, the pre-regime in Mexico, communist Eastern Europe, as well as colonial-era regimes in the 19th and 20th centuries. The religious leaders of these institutions are particularly important in resisting repression in these regimes. They are among what we would call civil society leaders. In the words of Philippe Schmitter, they serve as reservoirs of resistance to tyrannical action. However, I argue that religious leaders are distinct because they have a combination of unique characteristics which enable them to resist repression. First, they are locally embedded. That is, they have regular interaction with members of their religion and citizens in the community in which they have jurisdiction. This allows them to gather and aggregate local knowledge about events that occur in this area. And in particular, with respect to repression, this allows them to learn about instances of state violence that occur in their areas under their jurisdiction, even as the state may attempt to censor or obfuscate information about repression. Second, these leaders have public influence. That is, they serve as opinion leaders, and they do so because they possess traditional authority, which is derived on the sanctity of an order which is handed down from the past. And this gives them their opinions and words and actions additional weight with citizens when they issue statements. Furthermore, this traditional authority contrasts with the state's use of coercive power, which rules by the threat of physical sanctions. When faced with these opposed leaders, who can be considered alongside other opposition figures, regimes face a series of choices in how to respond. We might think that the regimes could co-opt, attempting to buy off these leaders' loyalty. They could repress them, attempting to eliminate or suppress their opposition, or they could accommodate them, conceding at least in part to their demands. However, for opposed leaders in particular, co-optation might be ineffective if these leaders' opposition is rooted in some deep-seated convictions that makes them resistant to being bought off. Repression could be another option. However, I argue that repression of these prominent religious leaders could trigger backlash because of their popularity with supporters. If these leaders are repressed, the supporters could become aggrieved, and resistance might actually increase compared to the situation in which these leaders were never repressed at all. This makes repression of these leaders, in fact, counterproductive. The regime's remaining option is to accommodate these leaders, conceding at least in part to their opposition to repression. And this means that repression would be reduced in areas under the jurisdiction of these opposed leaders. I test this main implication of the argument in Argentina during its Dirty War. Argentina was ruled by a right-wing military dictatorship from 1976 to 1983, with the stated goal of fighting a defensive struggle against leftist subversion, but in reality it waged an offensive campaign of repression in what became known as the Dirty War. And during this Dirty War, the regime forcibly disappeared and killed up to 30,000 people across Argentina. The Catholic Church was a prominent actor during the Dirty War in Argentina. First, it was locally embedded and had public influence. Its jurisdiction extended across the entire country, and Argentines tended to agree with or trust the church compared to other domestic institutions, particularly the military. Furthermore, the prevailing alignment of the church, at least at the national level, was sympathetic with the regime. Thus, the main independent variable of interest for this project is whether or not Argentine Catholic bishops, which are prominent subnational religious leaders in the church, were opposed to the regime. Based on archival and field research, I've documented the opposition, whether or not all 82 Catholic bishops during the dictatorship were opposed to the regime. From this research, I've identified 25 bishops, or roughly 30% of the bishops in Argentina, who were opposed to the regime. I then mapped these bishops to the individual departments, which are the second level of territorial aggregation in Argentina, as to whether each of these departments had an opposed bishop in its jurisdiction. The map on the right shows these departments for a cross-section of the data in 1976. The darker colors indicate departments under the authority of an opposed bishop, and the lighter colors indicate a department not under the authority of an opposed bishop. The dependent variables of interest for the study are repression, particularly disappearances and killings, which were the two most common types of repression utilized by the dictatorship during this period. I also include department-level covariates, pre-dictatorship political, socioeconomic, and religious characteristics, and I use as a model specification OLS regression with both geographic and temporal fixed effects. The department fixed effects and military subzone fixed effects account for unobserved time-invariant heterogeneity, which could explain both the level of repression in a given department year and bishop opposition. And I also account for temporal patterns by including year fixed effects in these specifications. Now, an important part of my ability to identify the effect of opposed bishops on repression is the indication that these opposed bishops' appointments were plausibly exogenous to the characteristics of the areas in which they were appointed. There is some qualitative evidence that the Vatican fully controlled the appointments of bishops without interference from the regime and independent of Argentine politics. In fact, there was a legal agreement enshrined between the Vatican and the Argentine state, which protected this Vatican control. I also offer quantitative evidence that the characteristics of areas with and without opposed bishops are balanced on a variety of time-invariant political, socioeconomic, and religious characteristics. I also have some evidence that the areas under the authority of opposed bishops are also balanced and not correlated with varying time-varying characteristics. With that in mind, I'm able to identify the effect of opposed bishops on repression in Argentina during the Dirty War, and I find that department years under the authority of opposed bishops have fewer disappearances and killings than department years that are not under the authority of such a bishop. Substantively, this effect for disappearances is about 1.5 to 2 fewer disappearances in a given department year, between about 1/3 and a half fewer killings in a given department year with an opposed bishop. However, there are several potential challenges to interpreting the meaning of these results. First, it could be the case that there's some measurement error in the independent variable in which I have misclassified whether or not certain bishops were opposed or not opposed to the regime. There's also the challenge of reverse causality, which is that bishops only were comfortable expressing opposition to the regime if they were in areas which had less repression. To address each of these challenges, I use an instrument which leverages the exogenous variation in which Pope appointed bishops. In particular, I use as an instrument whether or not a bishop was not appointed by John Paul II. Bishops not appointed by Pope John Paul II should be more likely to resist the regime, as John Paul II was known as a particularly conservative and orthodox pope, especially early in his tenure. This is indeed a strong instrument for bishop opposition, and estimates from the two-stage least squares procedure are both larger in magnitude and remain significant when compared to the baseline results. I also conduct a variety of robustness tests to account for the possibility of measurement error, as well as outliers. I recode or drop each bishop in turn and re-estimate the main results, which remain robust. I also account for the possibility of spillovers, in which bishops who are opposed to the regime could affect the level of repression in areas outside their jurisdiction. And I find that the results remain robust and that there are likely not spillovers. And furthermore, I conduct a sensitivity analysis, which indicates that 44% of my main result would need to be due to bias in order to invalidate its significance. I also account for a prominent alternative explanation in which supporting bishops could be driving the effects that I find. That is, supporting bishops could increase the level of repression in areas under their authority rather than opposing bishops decreasing it. Through qualitative and quantitative evidence, I'm able to rule out this possibility. Generally, I find that supporting bishops for the regime appear very systematically similar to those bishops that were neutral or ambivalent towards the regime. They did not systematically aid or facilitate repression, whereas opposed bishops did systematically oppose and take actions to obstruct repression. Given this robust relationship between opposed bishops and a reduction in repression, I consider which mechanisms could explain or account for this relationship. The first mechanism I consider is persuasion. In the persuasion story, opposed bishops were able to engage with agents of the regime and convince them that repression is morally inappropriate and should be reduced. I test this mechanism in two different ways. First, I determine if opposed bishops who also served in Argentina's Episcopal Conference were more effective at reducing repression than opposed bishops who were not in the Episcopal Conference. The Episcopal Conference was a church body whose members had greater teaching or moral authority than bishops who were not in the conference. I find that opposed bishops in this conference were in fact no more effective at reducing repression than opposed bishops not in the conference. I also examine opposed bishops who served in areas with cavalry officers. We know from the work of Adam Sharp that cavalry officers in Argentina had particular ideological reservations about carrying out repression, and thus we would expect them to be more persuadable in reducing repression. However, I find that opposed bishops were no more effective at reducing repression in areas with cavalry officers. The second mechanism I consider is protection. In this account, opposed bishops are able to reduce repression because they assist in sheltering targets of repression with the help of local agents, such as priests and adherents of the church. I examine this by first looking at whether opposed bishops were more effective in areas where there were also more progressive priests in the pre-dictatorship period. I do find some limited but inconsistent evidence that these opposed bishops were more effective where they had more of these progressive priests. I also examine whether opposed bishops were more effective if they had progressive networks of clergy and laypersons known as ecclesial-based communities, and I find no evidence that opposed bishops were more effective at reducing repression when they had these networks in their areas. The final mechanism I consider is mobilization. In this account, opposed bishops are able to reduce repression because they rally the public against the regime and apply political pressure. In order to test this mechanism, I look for outcomes after the dictatorship with a cross-section of my data measuring the percentage of years under the dictatorship in which an area had an opposed bishop. I find areas that had opposed bishops for more time during the dictatorship had a greater share of Catholic adherents in 1988, 5 years after the dictatorship ended. I also look at human rights mobilization outcomes after the dictatorship, and I find that despite the fact that areas with opposed bishops were able to reduce repression significantly, they had no fewer sites of memory for victims of repression after the dictatorship. Similarly, for human rights trials, even though these bishops were able to reduce repression in areas under their jurisdiction, I find that these areas had no fewer human rights trials for perpetrators of repression than areas without these opposed bishops. Finally, I'm also able to generalize these findings to a different type of religious leadership in Argentina, Catholic religious orders that opposed the regime, and I find similar effects. To conclude with discussion, this paper has shown that religious leaders who are locally embedded and publicly influential communal elites in states can constrain the use of authoritarian repression. One of the implications, theoretically, of this paper is that these non-state actors are able to play a role in monitoring by gathering information and holding accountable authoritarian regimes when there are a lack of such institutions to provide this accountability in authoritarian regimes. Additionally, I've shown the effects of a different type of power that is wielded by these religious leaders, symbolic or traditional power, and have shown how it undermines the coercive power of the state. However, we know from other historical examples that this type of power may also be a complement to state coercive power. And finally, I've shown that religious institutions at the national level that might be perceived as monolithic are in fact quite diverse when we look at subnational religious leaders, suggesting that researchers in this area could find a rich amount of variation studying local level or subnational level religious leaders. This project is also part of a broader research agenda. In my dissertation, I'm generally interested in how non-state actors shape authoritarian repression. Beyond this paper, I have a paper which explores how citizens' political rivalries in Chile increased repression during the Pinochet dictatorship. And I also develop a formal model which shows the effects of violent dissent on repression, which are conditional on the capacity of the state. I'm also interested in how public perceptions of resistance, violent and nonviolent, affect public support for repression. And I'm also interested in how authoritarian repression continues to shape politics even after transitions to democracy, particularly with respect to human rights. So thank you all for your time, and I look forward very much to the discussion and comments.
All right, thanks, Pearce.
Thanks, Pearce.
To our panel of discussants. I don't know, so Courtney, Jason, or Christopher, I don't know who wants to jump in first, but we'll just start off with some discussion, give Pearce a chance to jump in as well and respond, follow up to the comments.
I'm happy to start. I have a kind of I think a big picture framing question, Pearce. Sort of a part theoretical question. But first, I really enjoyed the paper. I thought the paper was really interesting. It was really a pleasure to read. You know, going through I have a lot of notes where I was about to ask you a question, and then you answered my question in the paragraph, the next paragraph. And so, you know, it was really, really an interesting paper, substantively really interesting and really, really carefully done attempts at causal inference here. So thanks for a great paper. So I think my sort of big picture question, and the reason I jumped in first, is that because you argue that one of the real contributions of the paper here is that you're considering a different actor here, right? So, and it's an actor that you argue has this traditional or this symbolic power. And then, you know, your theory talks about how religious leaders who possess it can potentially subvert the state's coercive power. And there seems to be an implicit argument here that this is different than the manner in which other actors might be able to subvert the state's coercive power. So I guess I wonder, is that actually the case? So my sort of larger question is this a paper that argues that religious leaders are going to be conceptually different than other types of mobilizing figures? Or does the bishop element here for you just provide you with a nice empirical test that gives you some plausible exogeneity that can help you get around these inferential problems that we know exist? And I think this is an especially important question because the mechanism that you find support for in the latter part of the paper, mobilization, is one that's applicable to lots of other actors, right? And the ones that you don't, like protecting targets and persuasion of the regime, those are actually the mechanisms that I think are most specific to religious leaders' embeddedness, which I think is actually what, you don't really argue this, but I think it's what makes them different conceptually than these other norm entrepreneurs. And so I guess I wonder if you can talk a little bit about whether or not this is actually theoretically intended to tell us something about the effect of religious leaders that's different, and then whether or not you think your empirics then support religious leaders being different, or again, if this is just sort of a nice causal identification strategy.
Yeah, thank you. That's a fantastic question. I mean, I think religious leaders, I kind of classify them under this broader umbrella of non-state actors. I do think that the type of power that they wield is qualitatively different than a lot of other non-state actors. Religious institutions are unique in their claim to this kind of enduring tradition. Although you might argue that for certain people in certain time periods, things like norm entrepreneurs might speak to these types of kind of symbolic issues as well. Although maybe that's not with the same deep centuries-long tradition as a lot of religious leaders do. In terms of the mechanisms, I mean, I think there is some limited evidence for their ability to protect the targets, at least as far as their priests are concerned. But really what I see them as is complementary to these other non-state actors. So I think the Argentine case is particularly interesting because these leaders leverage the combination of their embeddedness and their influence in order to mobilize, right? So the mobilization in Argentina was contingent on the fact that people knew that the repression was going on in the first place. And there's a lot of authoritarian regimes, at least those who aren't carrying out, genocide, that are going to attempt to at least conceal or suppress information about repression from reaching the broader public. Or if they do, they're going to really carefully control the narrative that they present about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And so what was essential in the Argentine case was to kind of puncture that narrative and say, no, the use of regime force is actually quite arbitrary. And the only way to determine that is to actually collect independent information about what's happening. And so the bishops, through their embeddedness, were able to collect this information. And then that, combined with their ability to mobilize, right, is what made them unique. And I think, but what's complementary about this is it connects to the human rights story, right? Because international human rights mobilization was a big part of the pressure against the Argentine regime. And there's actually substantial evidence that bishops were feeding information to national level human rights organizations in Argentina, which were then appealing to outside HROs and that kind of mobilization. So I see the embeddedness that bishops have as kind of putting them as kind of one link in this chain of other non-state actors' resistance to and mobilization against dictatorships.
Like Christopher has a follow-on comments.
Yeah, Courtney, I'd like to, I guess ask you to kind of push that a little bit further. Because when I was thinking about this, it was much closer to the way in which this church religious authority theoretical concept shapes the equilibrium balance between repression and dissent. So in theory, if repression is abating, then the expectation of dissent is going to, if there's holding all else equal, everything else the expectation of dissent should increase. And so are we seeing corresponding levels of dissent that are increasing as a function of reduced repression? Or are we seeing that like rate of repression to dissent, that like beta value shifting?
Sorry, is that a question about what the expectation of?
Kind of. And so it's like when we're talking about whether this institution is comparable to other institutions.
Mm-hmm.
Other institutions mobilizing against the state, theoretical expectation there is that repression should go up. At the same time, I was thinking of kind of Doug McAdam, kind of solidarity stuff in Poland. Like these are sites of both resistance, but also protection from repression. As a function of their ability to protect their members from repression, they serve as instruments for mobilizing against the state. And is that a theoretical concept you have? Do you anticipate that these would also be sites of additional anti-state activity? I mean, it's not really in the empirics, but I'm curious.
Yeah, I mean, and that's something that I would like to find more indicators of, because that's definitely a story that comes out in the cases you're describing. I mean, it's funny, the famous example of like the protests in East Germany, right? Like a lot of those were actually incubated in the church in Leipzig that started those demonstrations in the late 80s. And there's been some similar evidence from Argentina that there was protection or kind of this network of safe houses or other sources of sheltering opponents during the Dirty War. And so that's something that I don't think I have strong evidence for with the indicators I have in the paper now, but I certainly think that's part of the story, and something else that, to Courtney's point, that is part of these institutions like local embeddedness, that they have a presence in every community, every parish across the country, that they're able to provide the sheltering, which goes hand in hand with being able to mobilize publicly, right? If you don't protect or incubate this activity early on, then you won't be able to deploy mobilization later. So I definitely think that's part of the story. It's just a question of finding evidence for it. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Pearce. So just to get to the on the point of embeddedness, so you really want to argue that the institution is embedded, right?
Right.
I don't know how embedded the bishops are. In other countries, the bishops are rather distant. It's the parish priests that are actually embedded with the population, and not the bishops who are in their, castles. Certainly in Eastern Europe, the bishops were pretty far away from the laity, and so you don't talk. You talk a bit about the dynamics between the bishops and the parish priests, but it would be the parish priest that would be protecting people.
Right.
And sometimes in opposition to sometimes with the support of an opposed bishop, and sometimes in opposition to an unopposed bishop, because bishops were often co-opted.
Right. Sorry, Courtney, did you? I saw you had
Courtney had a.
Yeah, I was just going to say I had sort of a similar perspective as Jason here, in that I kept wondering what was going on with the priests. And there's a little bit of discussion of the priests, and you talk more about the priests in some of your later tests. You use them to sort of test one of your mechanisms. But I wonder, one of the things that I like that you did is you said, well, if you don't buy my plausible exogeneity of bishops, right, well, then let's look at the Pope. Right. And so I wondered if you could do something similar here with priests, right? So because theoretically, I wonder if Jason is right, and what's actually going on with regard to protection is that the bishops are pretty far removed, and that the priests are much more involved in protection. I assume the reason you didn't use the priest data to start with was because you don't have this there's not as strong of an argument for plausible exogeneity with the priests, right? But you do sort of do something similar in the paper when you move to the Pope and say, well, this is arguably more exogenous. And so I wonder if you could also include a test of priests earlier in the paper to see whether or not priests are actually the ones who are engaging in this protection, not just as part of sort of this plausibility check of your mechanisms, but as part of like one of the main empirical analyses. Because again, I think theoretically, Jason is onto something here, that maybe what's going on is that the priests are actually more theoretically involved in the protection than the bishops.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that at least in Argentina, from the case, and just to compare and contrast with Eastern, that a lot of these opposed bishops in particular were very involved in going. They would go to local areas. They would visit like agricultural workers. They were involved in organizing collective action before the dictatorship. They participated. I mean, one of the big undercurrents that you saw in the paper in the empirical side is this movement of priests for the third world, which was very active in Latin America during this time, and this kind of broader current of liberation theology. And the bishops were actually quite involved with that group. So one of the most common indicators of an opposed bishop that I had in the measurement was whether or not these bishops were participating in conferences of these priests before the dictatorship. So I think, at least for these opposed bishops, there definitely was more engagement with the local parish level. For sure, the co-opted bishops, the more right-wing bishops who have this very different view of the church as kind of removed from society or integrated with the state and the military, those bishops were certainly more removed and less attentive to what was going on at the local level. And I also think just the nature of the authority between bishops and priests is that bishops have the ability to remove priests who are agitating, right? So it's definitely endogenous, like the level of, so to your point, you could leverage that to say, okay, well, we expect these opposed bishops to appoint more priests who would be more sympathetic, right? And then would that make them more effective in repression? I think that's true, although I also think that for that same reason, that opposed bishops are going to observably also have an effect on repression, even at that level, because of the degree of control of what goes on underneath them in the hierarchy. But I agree that I like that idea of incorporating what you're saying, a similar strategy of pope to bishop from bishop to priest.
Sorry. So I'll just throw out two questions, Pearce, because one is really, really short. So figure one, it looks to me like that opposition that you have there in figure one is really geographically clustered. So I just wonder whether or not bishop opinions are independent of the opinions of other bishops, and what the extent to which you think that matters in terms of your inference strategy. And then, so second, kind of an unrelated question about the mechanism here. So I'm going to push you a bit on the mobilization mechanism theoretically. So you argue that mobilization affects public attitudes and behavior. Okay, so if I buy that, why does that decrease government repression, right? And because you show sort of relatively small substantive effects. So if mobilization is the main mechanism at play here, and I think this is kind of related to Chris's question, it also might promote repressive responses too, right? So I wonder if what you're seeing here is partially a depressed effect, because while mobilization decreases repression some, it also provides the state with incentives to increase repression under some circumstances. And that wouldn't be the case with your other mechanisms, right? They don't simultaneously provide the state with additional incentives to repress. And so I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you think this mobilization mechanism works. Why does this change in public attitudes in equilibrium lead to a decrease in repression, given that we know this relationship between repression and dissent is endogenous?
Great. Yeah. So on your first point, just for the clustering, so what you're actually seeing in Figure 1 are the dioceses of these bishops, right? So in order to account for the kind of clustering of treatment, so to speak, of those bishops, I do cluster the standard errors at the diocese level to account for those interdependence between those areas. So that addresses it. So those are not multiple. Some of them are multiple opposed bishops in proximity, but a lot of that is the single bishop who might have authority over that area. And I also aggregate the results up to the diocese level, and they're consistent. On the theoretical question about mobilization, I mean, I think that there's a lot of things about this empirical strategy that suggest that the deck's kind of stacked against what I find. And I think I talk about that a little bit in terms of the measurement strategy. So like there is evidence that these opposed bishops were very much involved in collecting information for the Commission on Disappeared Persons after the dictatorship. So that might be one reason we would expect to observe more repression in areas where there's opposed bishops, at least relative to the true amount. But then what you're saying, I think, is another wrinkle in that, which is that because of this kind of repression dissent nexus, or this law of coercive responsiveness, right, that more mobilization, more human rights activism in these areas where there's opposed bishops could mean that the state would repress more, right? So I think in that story, then, that what I find is potentially also underestimating the extent to which bishops were able to reduce the kind of that first round of repression. So they protected targets, right, and then potentially that could have triggered some additional state response. So that's kind of like the finer grained story that I think could be going on and would be nice to find evidence for. In terms of like the broader effects on public mobilization, yeah, I think that the reason why this worked and why the state responded to it and reduced repression in response to mobilization, or the threat of mobilization, was that it was appealing. It was, like I said earlier about information, it was revealing information to the outside world about what was going on, and it was kind of embarrassing to the state. So they were basically being told, like, you know, your narrative about what's going on in this leftist subversion is not actually true. You're just rounding up people and killing them arbitrarily, and this led to sanctions, boycott campaigns, right, from the international community. And so it was this kind of big black eye for the regime. And so one response then would be to kind of strategically cover it up or reduce it.
Yeah, on that repressive substitution, so the state's got a certain number of people it's going to want to kill. And why do we see, why should we theoretically expect, let's start with that, disappearances to go down?
Sorry, so substitution as in, could it be the case that the state was substituting the repression disappearances for other forms of repression?
Yeah, outright, just like killing somebody in the street, right? That decision is strategic and likely influenced by the same types of mechanisms you're describing with regards to the church.
Right. So that's one of the main reasons why I want to include both of those disappearances and killings measures, because to what you're saying, the killings are kind of those killings in the street, maybe more public forms of repression, whereas disappearances were both more common, and more common because to a large extent they were much more covert. So these enforced disappearances were, if you know about this regime, it's this kind of infamous image of the green Ford Falcon car that would kind of roll into a neighborhood in the middle of the night, and it would break into a home, abduct people, take them away, unmarked cars, ununiformed officials, right, and they would spirit them away to a secret detention center, right? So one concern could be, okay, well, maybe killings are reduced, right, because those are maybe public, but if the regime's trying to cover it up, maybe they'll increase those covert operations instead. But we see both of those going down. Now, I mean, the question is, could there be other, maybe softer forms of repression that the regime was substituting instead? Maybe just issuing threats against people as opposed to actually carrying out disappearances or killings. That's not something that there's systematic data for. But even so, I think that would be consistent with the story that if the severity of repression was ratcheted down, I think that would be consistent.
This raises a broader point about the government as a strategic actor. So a lot of the strategic acting comes from the church in your story, but there isn't a lot coming from the government. And so, to what extent are they, infiltrating, behaving as a strategic actor?
Right. Yeah. Thanks. I think that's a great question, and I think it's implicit, perhaps not as explicit as it should. And so I think about this as, kind of government response. What's the best response, conditional on the resistance that these opposed leaders are showing, and so I do a little bit of that by inventorying, the possibility of co-optation, the possibility of repression, and conclude that the government's best response should be to accommodate. And I think there's other, and I get into this a little bit too with the cavalry officers, is that there are kind of these other strategic principal agent issues for the regime as well, is that we expect, the repression was fairly decentralized in Argentina. And so a lot of the decisions, there were broad directives that were given out by the central military junta, but then these military zones and subzones had a lot of delegation in the repression that was carried out. And so, we might expect that there's variation, like I show, in the branches of there could be variation in the branches of service and their willingness to repress, and their strategies of repression could vary. And so I look at that with the cavalry officers, but I don't find necessarily results for that. So that, I think that's one of the main ways in which the state could strategically vary its response.
But for example, in Poland, Solidarity was riven with spies. And as a consequence, Solidarity was organized in a particular way to protect the organization because they knew they were being infiltrated. So I can't imagine something like that wasn't going on. Notwithstanding the relative liberalism, who was the Pope prior to John Paul II? Paul VI? Yeah. So notwithstanding the relative liberalism of Paul VI, the official church was, virulently anti-communist, even more so after John Paul II, comes into power. And so, I don't know, there just seems to be a tension there.
Right. Yeah, I mean, and a lot of what I know about this is more anecdotal, qualitative, and again, it'd be nice to continue to explore this archivally. But there were informants who operated. So there's the most famous human rights group in Argentina, the Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo, organized some meetings in churches early on when they were in 1977 when they were first getting going. So the church did incubate that resistance, but they also had military infiltrators who got involved in that movement. I think the issue with the church is that while there might have been spies kind of among church members, that because the regime came to power, suddenly in 76, it wasn't like they could send in, they couldn't anticipate years before, sending in priests or other officials who could. So instead, what they relied on were potentially priests or other lower level officials in the church who were complicit or supportive of the regime. There's one particularly notorious case of a priest in the capital of Buenos Aires who actually participated in torture in a detention center. So there are certainly examples of that. But I think when it comes to these opposed bishops, that, to the extent that they would know about that they would be able to adapt the organization or protect themselves from it. These bishops weren't, the regime wanted to take some of these guys out, but they were not effective in doing so.
Yeah, if I could try to just organize these ideas, I think that they, as a whole, are kind of coming back to Courtney's first question about the kind of repression dissent dynamics that underlie this. It's like, why is this case interesting? Because the state was systematically trying to remove people who were trying to systematically eliminate or remove the state, right? Like, there's this conflict that's underlying. It's not, we're not looking at a church under normal times. And so to pull that in on both sides, like who's being attacked, where's the spatial and temporal variation across of that, and then like what I'm thinking about is, I don't think this is actually the model you should pursue, but in my mind, this is like a two-stage model where the variation in protection is predicting how much descent, and not in an up or down way, just in a that much, the amount of variation that's induced by the in descent, the amount of variation in descent induced by the alignment of the church, that coefficient is going to go up or down, shaped by the relationship between the state and the church, right? Like descent under protected church, opposed church conditions is going to induce less repression than descent under a school, right? That kind of.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense. So I mean, I think the ideal test of what you were saying then would be to say, okay, let's, like I have data for opposed church officials, and then actually, if it were possible to collect data on individual instances of collective action in these areas by date and location in Argentina, right? And so then, in what you're saying, that would predict that opposed bishops would be more effective at preventing repression of collective action than, and whereas unopposed bishops or supporting bishops would kind of step back and just kind of nod and wink, and then the state would target collective action more effectively in those places. I think that's the story that you're suggesting.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, no, I think that's plausible, and that's the thing. There's really only circumstantial. I mean, there's anecdotal evidence of the different forms of collective action. Argentina has done a great job post-dictatorship in tracking all the instances of this mobilization, but the data is a lot more spotty during the regime. But I think that would be a certainly consistent and an extension of this mobilization story.
So the government wasn't keeping track of what was going on in an archival way during the dictatorship?
If they were, those records are not really accessible from what I've seen. I mean, I accessed human rights. So I do have evidence on, and one of the covariates is the presence of militants before the dictatorship. And so I did find archival documents of the government, like army intelligence in 1975 that I had identified where these like cells of leftist networks were. So I guess the next question is, for next step archival research for me, could I identify these instances, like exactly what Chris is saying, these geolocation of these resistance activities during the regime? I think that would be ideal. They were notorious for having destroyed a lot of records, so that might be a steep hill, but yeah.
So we're at about 5 minutes till 11 Central. So I'll, we want to round up any sort of last comments, and then we'll give Pearce a chance to respond to anything that we didn't discuss yet.
Pearce, do you know why certain bishops opposed the regime and others didn't?
I think it's a great question. I kind of in the paper with that. So the common argument, at least if you read a lot of literature on religion, the Catholic Church, especially in Latin America, is this argument that Protestant competition induces the Catholic Church to pivot to the left as kind of a means of getting greater support. So I think the big puzzle that maybe hangs over this bishop opposition is, well, Argentina was extremely homogenous, very Catholic country, and when you see these accounts of liberalism in the church, it's like, oh, well, Argentina is very conservative. It didn't have a lot of Protestants. But then I'm saying, okay, well, even within this context, there's a lot of opposition that can't be explained by the Protestant missionaries. So for me, I think a lot of this has to do with the kind of institutional trajectory of the church. There's some very kind of deep-seated traditions in the Catholic Church that are more progressive, and at least in Argentina, they're a minority. I think one potential source, and I get at this a bit in the religious orders, is the religious order of which these bishops initially were a member and came through seminary, right, and formed their preferences or selected into that order based on their preferences, right, at an early age or early time in their career. I think that's one possible source. I think early career formative experiences, like a lot of these bishops had been priests in various places across Argentina or other countries earlier in their career that exposed them to some of the social and economic issues that they became then advocates for later. So I would say those are the biggest potential explanations. But it is puzzling because it doesn't really fit with the primary account of where this opposition might come from.
Yeah. I think it's a two-finger on this, and I hope someone else has a good way to end the call, but I'm just curious. One of the things I was thinking, Pearce, as I went through, is you switch back and forth between the terminology of opposition to repression and opposition to the dictatorship. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if those things are synonymous. And so both conceptually and empirically in your coding, are you interested in the extent to which these bishops are opposed to human rights violations by the regime or opposed to the regime writ large?
Yeah.
Or is that the same thing in this case? I just don't know.
Right. I mean, so in Argentina, I would say for sure it's intertwined. Like the regime was premised on, right, taking out these, as they called them, leftist subversives. So to oppose the regime would be to oppose its reason for existence, which is this campaign of repression. Right, so political violence by the left and retaliatory violence by the right, et cetera, that was a big dominant theme in Argentina through the late 60s, early 70s. In other regimes, though, that maybe weren't premised on repression in that same way, I think those things might be distinct, and it would be potentially harder to measure opposition in the same way. But I think for Argentina, those two things are synonymous.
All right, so we've got about 2 minutes left. So if there's no more comments from the discussants, I'll give Pearce a chance to maybe round up any last thoughts, and then
I think Chris has something.
Oh, Chris.
Yeah, one thing I have to say, you can get it, Pearce. The conceptual distinction between religious institutions and religious leaders. You're trying to situate this as like not a macro institutional analysis and not like low-level leaders. I think is something you use. It seems much stronger to me, framed as an institution that is with spatial variance. And so the description of the mechanisms, definitely when you're talking about cultural power, has a lot more to do with the church than it has to do with the specific bishop, the bishop that shapes the institution locally. I just think it would be a much stronger paper if you spoke about institutions more, what these institutions are, and then how they affect things rather than the leaders themselves.
Great. Yeah, no, I appreciate that comment. And I think this gets back just to maybe tie together some of the common threads in the comments. I think this ties back to this original point about, how are religious institutions distinct from other non-state actors, right? And then within that, to the last point that Chris raised, how are these religious leaders distinct from the institution? I think the broader story is these leaders leverage the power and authority that the institution bestows on them, right, in a way which allows them to subvert the state. And this also relates to some of the other comments, is that because this is such a large institution, there's all sorts of layers. There's local priests, right? There's the Pope, and I think there's potentially more richness in the institution that I can exploit in developing the empirics. I mean, I think that ultimately the mobilization story that is instigated by the bishops is the primary driving mechanism. But the question just becomes what texture and detail can be added to that story. And so I think y'all are giving me a lot of great ideas for how to do that. And I really appreciate your comments.
All right, well, it looks like we're out of time for this iteration of the OPSC. So I want to first thank Pearce for sharing this excellent work with us. I want to had a similar thought, I think, to something Courtenay said. I was, this is outside of my area of expertise, but I was really impressed with the careful attention to detail in the empirical work. It was every time, as I read through the paper, every time I thought, I wonder if this is accounted for. It always was. So I look forward to seeing the paper out. Really, really interesting, great work. I also want to thank our panel of discussants, Courtenay, Jason, Christopher, for their careful attention to the paper and the great comments, and I'm sure they'll be very, very useful for Pearce. So that'll conclude our meeting today. If you are looking forward to our next session, it's going to be on April 24th, and we're going to have a really nice paper by Sabrina Karam and Sarah Behrens called Conflict or Crime: How Victimization Shapes Preferences for Public Goods Provision in Liberia. Just as a reminder, you can subscribe to us on YouTube or Apple Podcasts to follow along. You can also find all of the papers that have been presented today and in past presentations on our website. And finally, I'll encourage you to volunteer if you'd like to be a discussant in the future at a meeting of the Online Peace Science Colloquium. So with that, I'll again thank our presenter and discussants, and we'll sign off. Look forward to seeing you next time.